Annabel doesn't need an introduction to this group. We all know her well, but I will just say that she is, you may not know that she's been sort of a world-class documentarian, a leading political activist in the United States politics, and a social entrepreneur and a spiritual entrepreneur on some of the cutting edge ideas of how to deal with housing in America and how to also incorporate healthy food and diet and wellness into a person's life. So she's involved with very many activities that we only hear a bit about at church. But most important of all of her things that she's involved with is being president of our church and guiding us through some really interesting and challenging times. And I personally am grateful as the pastor, but also as a friend. So Annabel, we welcome you and appreciate all you do for the church. And thank you for leading us in the lesson this week.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I set out to talk about what is the connection between Christianity and democracy. And I want to start out by talking about, I think what the assumption is about Christianity and democracy right now, which is that that Christians who participate right now in politics and government tend to be conservative. But I want to see if we could kind of all step back and see if there's a way to figure out the sort of authentic Christian beliefs or values that should align with, I think, how we approach governance and policies in our society. But to get there, I want to tell you a little story. Well, two stories. One is about a documentary that I recommend all of you watch called Shiny Happy People. It's on Amazon, and it's about the Duggar family of the 19 Kids and Counting reality show fame. And probably you have at least heard of it. And this documentary ended up being really, really interesting because it to me, it's kind of the key that explains so much of American culture and politics right now. And I really had no idea how much of what's in it explained my own life and where I am in my journey. And so I mean, if you guys don't mind, I actually want to play the trailer for this documentary that you guys can all watch for free if you have Amazon Prime. So let me see if I can share the screen, because I think that this will help explain who I am, because I do have a personal connection to what's in this documentary. Oops, hold on a second. See if I'm doing this correctly. Share sound, optimize video clip. Okay. Okay. And let me know if you can't hear.
World domination was the goal.
If you have not gone through the basics seminar, I highly recommend it.
IBLP.
IBLP.
IBLP. The IBLP teachings aren't Christianity. There's something entirely different.
We have for every one of you the answer.
Thank you for agreeing to talk to us.
There's a story that's going to be told, and I would rather be the one telling it.
TLC created a PR show for Gothard's teachings.
You've probably heard of the Duggar family.
Everyone knew who the family was.
We were part of IBLP as early as I can remember.
The biggest feature of Bill Gothard's teachings is authority. Kids obey the parents, wives obey their husbands. Everyone obeys Bill Gothard.
Gothard turned every father into a cult leader and every home into an island.
I first read The Handmaid's Tale in college. I was like, this is my life.
Homeschooling is kind of the linchpin of this whole project.
The kids were not being well educated. Instead of learning math, you're learning slut shaming.
The Institute raises little predators.
Breaking news, a dark family secret is exposed.
It's like the epitome of evil. Breaks my heart to think about the girls.
Well, how
So, sorry. Yes, I won't play the whole thing, but it's really worth watching because this Bill Gothard has had enormous influence in our politics. And some of the politicians that we see regularly on TV and the media have actually been part of his institute and have grown up in it. And I just didn't really quite understand the extent of it until I really watched it. And then as I was watching it, I realized, oh, hang on a second. I have my own story about this. Because when I was in Houston, well, let me back up a little bit. My family and I immigrated from South Korea to the United States in December of 1977, when I was 9 years old, about to turn 10. And I ended up going to an evangelical Baptist church in Houston. And even before I could speak English, I was baptized in front of this mega church in this like hospital like robe. And it was all kind of part of my attempt to assimilate into American culture as an immigrant child. And at first I actually liked going to church because they showed up at the apartment complex with like donuts on the bus. And so I remember getting like really excited about going to church when I was little, but often I just felt like church was really boring or isolating, and at times just shaming. But I went off and on for years, believing that like if I didn't like church, it was my fault, and it's because I'm a bad Christian and a bad person. And when I was 14, and my older sister and I ended up going to a Bill Gothard event, like kind of like what you just watched in a stadium. And I don't even remember exactly why we decided to go, but I remember in the beginning of the event, it was like an all-day event, we were given a handbook, and I thought, oh my goodness, I didn't know there was like an actual handbook to living a good life, and that it was extremely detailed. It told you how to dress, it told you how to stand and sit. It was extremely detailed. But as the day went on, I remember just feeling extremely uncomfortable. And this is another thing I want to share with you guys about the experience. So there was part of this that I just realized was like so disturbing that I didn't realize as a 14-year-old that it basically taught you how to deal with sexual abuse. And that part of what they taught you was that, this abuse is partly a result of things like immodest dress and indecent exposure, being out from protection of our parents, being with evil friends, question mark. And so that was like, sample of some of the things that were like actually in this handbook. But as the day went on, I remember at one point, both my sister and I looked at each other, and because our BS detector started really going off, when not when he was telling us how to behave as women and submit to men, but when he said that classical music, rock music, most music was actually satanic. And so I remember at that point thinking, that's just crazy. And my sister and I decided to leave the event, and I just didn't go back to church ever again after that. So that was the end of my career as an evangelical Baptist in Texas. And then it wasn't until like 30 years later, I met Reverend Barber, well, now Bishop William Barber, who's a prominent civil rights leader. He actually won the 2018 MacArthur Genius Grant. People have referred to him as like the living Martin Luther King Jr. And he just became the founding director of the Center for Public Theology and Policy at Yale. But I met him in 2012 when he was leading the Moral Monday movement in North Carolina, he was trying to get national media to pay attention to the extreme conservative takeover of North Carolina state government. So I spent about 2 years following him and documenting his organizing. I spent a lot of time, especially in Black churches in North Carolina with Reverend Barber. But so I spent many hours at churches at that time. But in short, I'm going to give you links to Reverend Barber's work if you're not familiar. But he believes that the moral lessons of the New Testament should be reflected in our government and policies. So he says, for me, the teaching of Jesus is the highest. I don't claim to be preaching the left gospel, the right gospel, or living out the left gospel or the right gospel. It's just the gospel. And the gospel is clear that there's no separation between Jesus and justice. There's no separation between Jesus and caring about the least of these and challenging the systems, whether that system be racism, or economic exploitation, or ecological devastation, or the war economy, or false religious nationalism. The gospel is a critique of all of it. So I'm going to, put some links into the chat when I'm done. So, and it includes a couple of videos that I did with Reverend Barber that I would love for you guys to watch. So that got me back to church and really thinking about how I mislearned, or I was misguided about what the connection was between Christianity and democracy, because my experience with Bill Gothard and Evangelical Baptist Network was not a positive one. So now pushing forward, in 2016, I was very lucky and met Rich Toffel at a conference in Seattle. And I think that Bishop Barber and Rich are the antidote to Bill Gothard and what I think is toxic Christianity. So I think what I've learned from Rich since then, now it's 2023, oh my goodness, I think is that love, I feel like his message to me is like love is regenerative and there's no reason to be stingy with it. So I do feel like I've become just a more loving person and finding different ways to be more loving. And that there is a grace in and method to patiently listening and understanding others, even if you vehemently disagree with them. I mean, I always believed in trying to understand other people, but I think that I learned how to do it better through Rich. So I mean, these lessons that I've learned from Rich have had huge impact on me. But I don't know if I consider myself like a believer in the traditional sense. I mean, my head starts spinning when I think too much about theology. I think of the Bible, especially the New Testament, as as like a set of universal moral lessons that can guide us. But to return to the original topic at hand, I believe the connection between Christianity and democracy is love for justice and all people, especially the least of these, who are often exploited or neglected by those who seek power. So church is now a place that helped me get through some very difficult personal and political challenges in the last 10 years. And it's a place where I really have found community and friendships and mentorships and I think collectively devotion to justice and humanity. So I want to thank you all for being part of that journey and for being here. And I am going to share those links. Thank you.
Thank you. Did you have something you want to share? Oh, the links.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Excellent.
Yeah. So I just, you can copy and paste it.
Yeah. Thank you, Annabelle. That was beautiful. That's quite a pilgrimage. It's quite a journey. And it's neat to hear it all play out. It's quite a story. I have some questions and some thoughts
Okay.
I'd like to start with, but I'm curious. I want to see if anybody has a question or a thought or a reaction from the group first. Yeah, I guess my question about was when Reverend Barber said he's not the gospel of the left or the right. I think it's extremely hard for Christianity not to get pulled in one direction or the other. So I see a lot of people quoting it for either side in the polarized culture. That it seems like the churches have become polarized, and a lot of people tell me like I quit my church because of my pastor's politics. I didn't agree with. So that means that the churches are now like polarized and segregated. How does Christianity engage in politics without being pulled into one side or the other, or left, right, or into the polarities? How does it avoid that, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think there, besides the kind of binary game like kind of system we created in our politics, I think just philosophically, there are ways to think about something in a way that is outside of that system. Like in Greek philosophy, they call it an Archimedean point, from which you can take a look at something and form a critical analysis. And so I think for Reverend Barber, the Gospels presents like that perspective, that kind of eternal perspective that will be able to help you look at the entire thing and make an analysis. So, you have to just commit to intellectually and philosophically being able to look at it, look at the system. So yes, it's impossible to be completely outside the system, but intellectually, philosophically, we can think outside the system, even though people are going to try to push you into one thing or another simply by labeling you or accusing you. But I think it's important to have that intellectual integrity to be able to be critical of the entire thing. And Reverend Barber often says very critical things about the Democratic Party. So I actually think he's very good at talking about the entire thing without sounding like he's just cheerleading for the Democrats, and because he says, he says things like the Democratic Party has abandoned the poor.
Mm-hmm.
And he's extremely critical. And I think that he thinks that some of the extremists in the Republican Party has kind of taken it to another level of evil. I mean, I think he does believe that, but he does think that the entire system is bankrupt, morally bankrupt. Yeah.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have another question if anybody else. I don't want to keep hogging it. Somebody has another question. Anybody else? Raise your hand. Okay, so my second question is more about your faith path trajectory. Interesting, because you and I have a lot of similar things. I actually went to the Bill Gothard seminar too when I was in high school. So kind of interesting how we and I love that documentary. It's a little frightening.
Yeah,
but,
it was very frightening.
It never ends. Those stories never end well when you have authoritarian religious leaders. Never ends well, regardless of the faith. But my question's more mystical. So that is a very fundamentalist faith. And you were saying that you don't know where you are and what you believe, but, based on, say, what say a traditional Christian, what that means and all that. And then you were describing politics in more of like very practical ways. You're a very practical person. So like how it engages in the world. And I love that passage from Micah, that kind of is a great mission statement for anybody who wants to engage in social change. But what about like the mystical side? Do you do you feel any connection to spiritual energy or dreams or guidance or what you might in Swedenborgian language call divine providence? Is there anything like that outside of just sort of this practical philosophical way of looking at politics? Do you get guidance in other ways?
Yeah, well, although because I grew up in South Korea and there's a way of talking about that kind of spirituality and mysticism in Korea and Asia that's not connected to Christianity. It's something else. So they, you could call it shamanism or something else. And so because I grew up with that and just kind of accepted that was true. So I never felt like there was any conflict with mysticism or spirituality in that way, just that I don't think of it as one and the same. Like, I think you think of it as Christian mysticism. I just think of it as just our reality. Like, it's just there, and they're just different words for different experiences and different ways of accessing it. So I just don't connect it with Christianity.
Yeah, it sounds almost like
Mhm.
you tap into the mystical aspects, but it's a much more ecumenical, or it's not tied to any particular religion. It's just reality of it. But it is sort of underlying reality, more
Yeah.
aligned to sort of maybe like shaman or Korean.
Yeah. Yeah, and in fact, my grandfather, who was, abducted by North Korea at the beginning of the Korean War, and we never, heard from him again. He actually was the first person to really study like Korean shamanism and mysticism, like academically. And so it's just kind of been part of our understanding of the world. And so yeah, so it's like, it's funny, I feel like I have to kind of translate when I hear Christian mysticism, like, oh, it's actually, we're talking about the same thing.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Other questions or comments?
Annabel, were you ever homeschooled?
No, I wasn't homeschooled, no. And yeah, I mean, I just wasn't that fall into that whole world. I mean, I was kind of introduced to it and then I left. But so yeah, I didn't go that far into it. But I grew up with people who did, Yeah.
I have a question.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about the Korean mysticism, Annabelle, and how would you translate it? Because I've actually never heard of Korean mysticism. So I'd love to hear more about how do you translate that to Christian mysticism or Swedenborg? And how does that impact your daily life and the way you go about, your work and your perspectives?
You always ask the hard questions.
When I do
Well, I mean, I think it's more like, it's just an invisible part of our world, that sometimes you intersect with and sometimes you have access to, and some people can access it more easily than others, but it's just there, so it's basically really, to me, about not being like an empiricist where everything is about like senses. But if you accept that there are things out there that you're not going to be able to sense because we have limited senses, then I don't think it's a difficult concept, And so I think Korean shamanism is really about people who can speak to that world directly. They have a language for it and they have the gift for it. And that, in fact, in Korea, if you look like you're going through what to us looks like a schizophrenic or psychotic breakdown, they think of it as like the spirits trying to reach you and kind of clear you as a medium or a shaman. And so that's a very interesting way of looking at mental illness, because, and I'm sure that's changed, but they do think that they said, at least they used to think that that you're being touched by the spirits if you're having that kind of rupture with reality. And yeah, that always made a lot of sense to me. Because I kind of had an experience like that in my late teens where I thought, am I losing my mind? Am I going crazy. And my sister, who's an anthropology major at the time, told me about this and gave me a book about Korean shamanism that went into detail about this and really helped me, like, okay, there is another explanation for what I'm going through other than that, I'm just crazy and I'm sick. But that I'm basically being touched by things that are invisible. I don't know. I kind of always like that interpretation. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
Annabel, thank you so much for that interesting talk. I had twofold question. One, what do you think is the attraction of like Bill Gothard's theology to younger, more millennial folks these days? And the second part of the question is, how do you think these two versions of Christianity will shape the upcoming elections?
Oh my God. It's even harder. Oh my God. I think the attraction is, when you're spending a lot of time as a young person going, who am I? How should I live my life? How can I be a better person? What is the good life? Just feeling very confused about your identity. Someone gives you a handbook that says, this is the way you can be a good person. And that you're socially rewarded for it. And it's extremely detailed. You just have to follow it and obey. Then, yeah, it can be very attractive. And because some of the confusion might feel taken away, like, oh, I know what to do now. And so, yeah, I remember like being very drawn to this handbook and just being like, oh my gosh, I had no idea this was available. But then, of course, because we are constantly asking ourselves, who am I? But yeah, so I have not been able to find a similar handbook. So I've spent a lot of time being confused right now. But Rich is going to help me with this. And I think the election is, like what the trailer says, and if you watch the documentary, you'll see that people are drawn to authority. So that's the other way of saying what I just said. People are drawn to authority. They like authoritarian types. They like people who seem very confident and know what they always seem to have an answer for everything. So that's, I think, one sort of pole. And the other pole is like people really know that there's a lot of suffering out there. People are suffering. There's a lot of illness. There's a lot of loneliness, poverty, insecurity, fragility, and it's not being addressed institutionally. And people are just kind of like floating around trying to figure out how to survive. And they're looking for like lifeboats. And so I think that, if we can really present something that actually will help people survive and help with their suffering, then we're going to win in a more positive way than just like, oh, we're not them. We're not the authoritarians, but if we're like saying, no, we want to like help you, hold on, we're going to help you survive. That's what I would like to see. I just don't know if the Democratic Party will get there. I'm not holding my breath, but I would like to see them do more of that.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
I have a quick question for you. So now that you've come full circle, you're actually at a church, you help a church, you tell your friends, probably more like in the secular world, in the political world, that you're involved. What's their reaction? Like, do they freak out? Are they horrified? Or what's the reaction when you tell them that you're involved with the church in DC?
I don't know. I haven't had anyone be that surprised by it. Maybe because they saw me spend a lot of time at churches with Reverend Barber. I spent like hundreds of hours, I think, at churches. So I don't think they're that surprised by it. I still don't feel comfortable like saying like I'm a Christian, because I feel like there's a lot of baggage there. But I just believe in the moral lessons of the New Testament and the gospel. And so, so I feel like I kind of know, like intellectually, like I make that distinction. Because I don't want to be connected to like that evangelical world that I left. But yeah, I mean, I haven't had anyone be that surprised by it. I'm surprised they're not surprised, but I don't know. My mom is surprised because she thought I was lost, but yeah, but everyone else is okay with it. They don't seem surprised at all.
I guess we can tell people that when your mom first came to church, she pulled me aside and said, please, please, please bring her to Jesus Christ. Please bring her to Jesus Christ. Please, you have to save her soul. Remember?
Yeah, she thinks you're a saint. Anyway, well, thanks for this opportunity.